Hello and welcome back to AP World History with Miss Muir.
And Mr. Yarsowich.
Today we're going to be kicking off Period 4 and starting with Key Concept 4.1, Globalizing Networks of Communication and Exchange. Please take a moment to pause and read the Period 4 summary as well as the Key Concept 4.1 Big Picture Now. Here you can see a snapshot, an overview of the major empires that we're going to be studying in Period 4 in a few days' time. And we wanted to start with this image, even though we're not starting with the empires themselves, but we wanted you to notice how interconnected the world starts to become in Period 4. And you can see that we have empires that span across oceans in this time period.
On this map, it shows the routes that those different empires took to get there. Actually, before they became empires, they had to find the places and establish a foothold. And that process is something that we're going to look at today. So the different colors each represent a different explorer from this time period. There's one notable exception that's not from Europe, and that's Zheng He coming out of China in red. And we'll get to him in a minute. But they're going all over the place, and you can see in the boxes here some of the reasons why that they started doing the exploration. But if you remember from the post-classical era, it was the lucrative spice trade coming out of South Asia, Southeast Asia, that they really wanted to get a hand on and be able to access directly and cash in the way the merchants of the Italian city-states and the Ottoman Empire did. Here you see a map of one of those explorers, the Chinese explorer Zheng He. He was bought as a slave from the Muslim world, made a eunuch, and worked his way up. We said that domestic slaves could work as administrators. And here's an example of someone who worked his way up to be sort of the go-to man for a Ming emperor, the Yongle emperor. And he commissioned Zheng He to go on 7 voyages. And if you look at this map, you can see all of them originating over in China, and the first 3 voyages going through Southeast Asia and India, and then progressively further to the Middle East, and then even down to East Africa. So the whole of the Indian Ocean network was traversed over the course of 30 years or so by this man. What was he doing? Well, he was given an entire fleet of enormous junks. We're talking about 300 ships and 27,000 men or so, all sailing at once. Just a massive armada. And he was going to establish Chinese prestige in the Indian Ocean. And he would collect tribute. In fact, what you see here in the middle is probably a local representative offering a tribute or agreement or some sort of statement to him on behalf of the emperor. Here he is in his august robes. But what else can you see here? You can see the man here reading a compass, right? And that's one of those key technologies from the post-classical era that make these types of voyages on this scale possible. In this other image, you can see, again, in the right corner, a man reading a compass, and he's checking it against a map. And cartography, map making, what Zheng He is holding here, is really important as well. Mm-hmm. And that's for knowledge of these different places and the routes that they go, these explorers go on, expands and spreads.
I love the picture in the background. You can see an animal. This is one of those exotic animals that we often talk about that was exchanged across the Indian Ocean. Here's a giraffe. So what's happening in this image, and it's sort of a famous anecdote about the voyages of Zheng He, is he retrieves a giraffe from East Africa and brings it back to China.
So sort of tribute payment in kind, if you will. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine the splash that made.
Nothing says wealthy like a giraffe.
That's right. Other explorers. At the very beginning of the period, the Portuguese start the European explorations. And they do that with enhanced knowledge of ocean patterns, wind patterns, and currents of the Atlantic Ocean. You can see those cycles, the gyres, along the Atlantic Ocean here. And you can see he made multiple voyages, and what they're looking for India. That's where they want to go. That's where the wealth is. Load up your ships with those spices, bring them back, make a boatload of money.
Right. So to speak.
So how did he get there? Well, here you have Vasco da Gama, the one making these voyages, and he got there on a special ship called a caravel. And I'll show you that in just a second. I want to point out, too, though, the religious insignia here. One common thing that inspired or perhaps justified the explorations was both, really, yeah. Mm-hmm. And the establishment of colonies was certainly gold from the trade, but also God and the sort of commission to spread Christianity throughout the world. Right. And then after the Reformation, it became a competition.
Right, to spread the right kind of Christianity.
The right Christianity's got to go.
Yeah, we have to remember that preceding this age of exploration was a traumatic time for Christianity, for Christians in Western Europe anyway, in the Crusades. And the sort of crisis and the realization that the Islamic world had expanded and become very vast relative to the Christian world. And so that sort of inspired, that reality of how large the Islamic world had become definitely contributed to the desire to seek out new areas that could be Christianized.
Yeah, and that's, so in addition, we saw the Crusades caused the explorations in a couple of senses. They diffused the technology to Europeans. It exposed Europeans to the tastes, the market, creating a demand for those spices from South and Southeast Asia. And again, the sort of religious competition against this ongoing centuries-long competition between the Muslim empires. Right. So Vasco da Gama had some support, and we see that with all of these emperors, actually, kings, really probably a better way to put it, in Europe, sponsoring. And here in the bottom left you see Prince Henry the Navigator. He was a Portuguese royalty, and he's famous for sponsoring a school to teach about shipbuilding.
Right. School of navigation.
That's right. Map making. And one of those ships that they made was the caravel.
Great.
And you can see in that it's a combination of a sort of square topsail and that lateen sail that we saw from centuries ago being used in the Indian Ocean trade network. Now it is being adapted and being used by the Europeans.
Everyone should know this picture.
This is Christopher Columbus, all right? The holiday that we sort of still celebrate.
Okay.
He sailed for Spain, even though he was Italian, and he took, like da Gama, multiple trips across the Atlantic. And he was not looking for the New World. No, he was looking for India. He wanted to get to that Indian Ocean trade network. But he found...
which incidentally is why the islands there in the Caribbean are often referred to as the West Indies, and why the native people had this name of Indian, because in his first few trips, the first contact with the Americas, he didn't actually realize that he wasn't in Asia.
He never met an Indian before, so how did he know? Well, eventually they did not find the spices they were looking for, but they found a few other things, most notably gold. Yeah. But why is he sailing west? Well, the Portuguese had already established trading posts along the route around Africa, and they're going to defend those if necessary. And so it's just finding an alternative route, but to get to the same destination. The fact that there's two large continents in between them means that something else happens, and that changes world history forever.
Yes.
More on that later. How did he get there? Well, here we see again the technology. Notice it's the same technology as Zheng He. Right? And Columbus is sailing at the end of the 15th century. Zheng He was sailing at the beginning. Right? Well, map-making technology, the compass and astrolabe, also using ships adapted from the Portuguese innovations. One other explorer you should be aware of is Magellan. He also sailed for Spain, and that's the reason why the Philippines ultimately became part of the Spanish Empire in Southeast Asia. But going around the Americas, they still wanted to get there. They found something they didn't expect.
Right. But still the ultimate goal is to get to Asia.
That's where the money is.
Right. So here's this map again, just to give you an idea of the various explorers and the routes that they took in this time period. So as the Europeans realized that they had quote unquote, discovered an entirely new continent of the Americas, they started to, of course, you've got Magellan, who sailed around the southern tip of South America, but you also had some explorers that tried to go north. And the search for a way to Asia around the northern part of North America was called the search for the Northwest Passage. In other words, the Northwest Passage was this sort of mythical route that would take Europeans directly to Asia, north of the continent of North America. Of course, in that time period, never found an actual Northwest Passage.
They had no idea how big North America was.
Right. But they sure did try.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last part of this video is relating to one of the most catastrophic events that has happened in world history in terms of the history of the human race, and that is, we call it the Columbian Exchange. So I want to take a moment, first of all, to point out to you the difference between a trade network and the Columbian Exchange. So, of course, as you saw on the maps, Europeans are making contact with the Americas, and of course, trade networks between the Americas and Europe developed, and trade networks between the Americas and Asia developed, and along those trade networks, commodities and luxury goods were exchanged. But that's very different from what the Columbian Exchange is. The Columbian Exchange is really a transfer of biological things, plants, animals, diseases, bugs, and so this is a transfer, right? It's sort of a one-time occurrence. We're not trading tomatoes and corn and potatoes across the Atlantic Ocean here. This is an exchange, and the exchange happens as a result of new contact between the Old World, which is Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the New World, which is North and South America. So this slide is really all we need to show you exactly what that exchange was. You can read. I highly recommend that you pause and take note of some of the products. You see in the arrow going from the Americas to the Old World, things like tobacco, sweet potatoes, regular potatoes, squash, corn, peppers, tomatoes. I also want to point out quinine. Quinine is a plant that is used to treat various diseases, most notably malaria. And so you can imagine the demographic impact that that would have, as well as the introduction of the staple crops like corn and potatoes. With the introduction of corn and potatoes into the Old World, the diets of the common people were transformed dramatically, and population boomed in the Old World as a result of incorporating these plants from the New World.
And just as you go through the list, think about some of the consequences that would happen from introducing livestock to a place that never had it before. Agriculture, you've seen this before in world history. You should be able to anticipate what the consequences are.
Right. And traveling from Old World to New World, of course, the livestock, like Mr. Yarsowitz just mentioned, things like horses and cattle and pigs and sheep, they were not, well, horses had been extinct by the time they were reintroduced into the Americas, but these other animals had never been grown, or had never been not
raised,
grown, raised, cultivated,
Found.
yes. And then, of course, you've got crops like sugarcane and citrus fruits and coffee beans, and later cotton comes along. And those crops are introduced specifically to be grown as cash crops to generate profit, huge profits, to the European mother countries that colonize them. And then, again, on this line of catastrophic events, we zoom in on the diseases. So you've got a list of diseases that were indigenous to the Old World that had never been introduced to the New World before. Here you can see the effect of the measles. This is an illustration of the native Amerindians of the Americas being infected and suffering from the measles. So these diseases were catastrophic. Again, I can't say that word enough.
No, when we say catastrophic, we mean like 90% of the population could be wiped out from the introduction of this epidemic disease. That's 9 out of every 10 people. Right. And you can imagine, what does that do to the psyche of a people, of the survivors even? What does it do? It's really, that's how the New World was conquered, because most of them died from disease.
And it's not even that necessarily these diseases were intentionally introduced. It's just a byproduct. You know, the Europeans, Africans, and Asians, these diseases had long been sort of running amok in those areas, and people had developed a certain immunity and were carriers of the germs without suffering from them. But as carriers of those germs, when they get to the Americas, the natives had absolutely no immunity to those diseases because they hadn't been exposed to them before. So they were extremely deadly and resulted, like Mr. Yasowicz said, in anywhere between 50 and 90%. We don't have written records in a lot of places to say for sure, but we can be pretty confident anywhere between 50 and 90% of the Native Americans died as a result of these germs.
And that's it for this video. We'll have 2 more up for you in the next coming weeks, and the parts that we didn't cover in this video, yes, we will cover in class in our activities, so do not fear. We'll see you tomorrow.
Yay.